Writing can tell you a lot about a person. It can give insight into what they're thinking, what they believe, what they value. Sometimes, however, the words are foreign. The person feels like a stranger, even though you've read a great deal about them. Writing and identity don't have a very straightforward relationship, which can be seen in the contrast between Romanticism and Modernism. While one takes the reader into the inner workings of the mind, the other leaves the reader just outside, guessing and wondering at what may be within. In this video, I'll argue that the Modernists reuse and repurpose themes and techniques of Romantic literature in their search for identity. This can be seen in three key areas. First, I'll analyze the idea of Romantic fragmentation and its use in Modernist perceptions of the world. Then I'll explore the relationship between writer and landscape in these periods. Finally, I will map out the search for the self within both periods and ultimately define what identity means to the Romantics and the Modernists. Fragmentation in the Romantic era referred to the ability to critically distance oneself from one's experiences or environment in order to critically reflect and understand them. This distance was used to control and understand one's emotions at the time of said experience as well, which William Wordsworth called the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. Romantic fragmentation allowed one to put feelings into words that they and the reader could understand. But Modernist literature instead puts its own spin on this and uses fragmentation not to understand, but to confuse. Romantic fragmentation in the Modernist era is not meant to create distance between person and experience, but between person and audience. Instead of looking back to reflect, Modernist literature places you in the present moment and simply retells the story. Hemingway sentences are a good example of this, as they are deceptively simple. Bouncing from one thought to the next and being held together by many conjunctions, they serve to disorient the reader while also providing a description of the current moment. A Moveable feast serves to place the reader within Hemingway's Paris at this moment in time, yet within this retelling it seems as though we still only know the surface of Hemingway's experiences. His description of his Paris home, for example, is described in only 2 sentences. Home in the Rue Cardinal Lemoine was a 2-room flat that had no hot water and no inside toilet facilities except an antiseptic container, not uncomfortable to anyone who is used to a Michigan outhouse. With a fine view and a good mattress and springs for a comfortable bed on the floor, and pictures we liked on the walls, it was a cheerful, gay flat. Although home is a very personal space, Hemingway's writing manages to keep us on the outside, as if we're looking in through the doorway. Using the term anyone serves to generalize the description, but simultaneously alienate the reader, as if the reader knows what it is like, or should know what it is like to use a Michigan outhouse. This is also seen in the mentions of the pictures they like on the walls, generalizing but also alienating, as if we should be able to imagine what kind of pictures hang. The idea of fragmentation is altered to the uses of modernism and its focus on perspective, where modernists both used an altered version of fragmentation and also become the fragment themselves, or fragment their environment and perspective. Within this quote, we are given descriptions of fragments of their home, and in these descriptions they use the modernist idea of fragmentation to place distance between themselves and their audience. These fragments are not meant to be points of reflection, rather, they are just pieces of the story. Hemingway's sentences read like a stream of consciousness style of writing, which can make some parts difficult to follow, but also does not leave room for critical reflection. In dealing with addict friend Dunning, Hemingway asks his friend Evan Shipman for help. Shipman found this French phrase interesting, which spoke about Dunning climbing onto the roof of his flat and refusing to come down. Shipman believed there was something symbolic about it, but this was something that Hemingway would not know. Amidst the chaos of dealing with Dunning, Hemingway also states that he doesn't know why Dunning threw bottles at him as well. Rather than dwelling on these points, Hemingway simply states them as facts. Instead of trying to understand or critically reflect, he only says that he does not know and leave these points inaccessible to the reader, but also to himself. Saying that he does not know and just moving on to the next thought removes this critical distance from this experience and instead adds a distance or an ambiguity of some sort. After reading about small parts of Hemingway's experience in Paris, the reader still only understands on a surface level. If the sense of understanding is removed from modernist fragmentation, then the importance of perspective replaces it. Stein's autobiography of Alice B. Toklas places more emphasis on descriptions of fragments rather than putting together a comprehensive image, which makes for an ever-shifting setting that the reader must work hard to follow. Stein, or Alice in this book, recounts her life in Paris and her time spent with Stein, giving insight into both of their lives and their experiences during this time. While Hemingway's sentences merge together like flowing thoughts, Stein writes in the conversational style of Alice, making her writing a bit more difficult to follow. As Alice recounts her first dinner at the Rue de Fleureux, she jumps between descriptions as if she's just remembered them. She begins to describe the apartment, then talks about the housekeeper Helene, and then states, "Before I tell you about the guests, I must tell what I saw." This sentence makes it apparent how important sight or perspective is, as it becomes one of the only ways in which the reader can get a sense of the scene that's unfolding. But in her description of what she saw, twice she says, "But to return to the pictures." Even though there's much focus on what is seen, the perspective jumps around, so you're only able to get small fragments of the current scene. The use of perspective, especially in Alice's conversational style writing, greatly disorients the reader and prevents one from fully understanding the perspective of the author. Pieces are put together almost haphazardly to create an ever-shifting image of what the author sees, which successfully puts a great deal of distance between author and reader. Nietzsche claimed that the dominant view of the world was one of a multitude of potential perspectives, which is how modernist literature attempts to view the world. This multitude of perspectives, or fragments, are placed together to create unique views of the world. While they're not necessarily created for critical reflection, they allow both author and reader to understand the world in different ways. Romantic authors brought the reader along in their discovery of the self, but this quest for an exploration of the nature of the self is continued through this disorienting walk through an ever-shifting image. The landscape of Romanticism was one of peace and tranquility, portrayed as a place of rejuvenation where one was able to get in touch with their most elemental feelings. Set in the rural countryside, nature was seen as an escape from encroaching urbanization. The Industrial Revolution marked the period of eroding green spaces, or a quickly disappearing place of escape. For the modernists, however, escape was not an option. The peaceful landscape now resembled large urban centers and bustling cities, leaving very few spaces for reflection or peace. With this literary period taking place after the First World War, the question of survival now arose. How do we live within the ruins? For Stein and Hemingway, the natural landscape resembled the chaos of Paris. In autobiography, Alice recounts Stein's brother saying to her that human nature is so permanent in France that they can afford to be as temporary as they like with their buildings, highlighting the transience of the modernist landscape. The Romantics attempted to ground themselves within the natural landscape, believing it to be a stable basis for tranquility but also nurturing. Compared to the impermanence of the Parisian landscape, the only constant part of this landscape for the modernist was the chaos of the city. This quote highlights the tension between permanence and impermanence that's present in modernist literature. The desire to discover identity cannot be separated from the ever-shifting landscape of industrialization. This is also seen in Hemingway, where he claims that Paris was a very old city, and we were young, and nothing was simple there. The age of the city and the permanence of human nature reflect past traditions deeply rooted within the fabric of the landscape. But the temporariness of the buildings and the complexity of the city speak to the landscape of the modernist instead of the romantic. Stability was now found in the chaos and shifting image of Paris, and rejuvenation was no longer found in nature but in art and in each other. The place of tranquility for the modernist was now the salons, the ateliers, the galleries and exhibits, and more importantly, the community. One could get in touch with one's most elemental feelings through the landscapes of art, which provided a close substitute to the nature of the romantic. Hemingway provides a good example of this, where he recounts his time gazing at paintings in the Luxembourg Museum. You could always go into the Luxembourg Museum, and all the paintings were sharpened and clearer and more beautiful if you were belly empty, hollow hungry. I learned to understand Cézanne much better, and to see truly how he made landscapes when I was hungry. I used to wonder if he were hungry too when he painted. It was one of those unsound but illuminating thoughts you have when you have been sleepless or hungry. Later, I thought Cézanne was probably hungry in a different way. Hunger sharpens Hemingway's senses and makes him more perceptive to the intricacies of Cézanne's landscapes, similar to how immersion within nature makes the romantic more perceptive to their own emotions and sense of self. These sharpened senses point to a more realistic viewing of the landscape, one that is not sentimentalized and that one can easily access and understand themselves within. The literature of the modernist period also marked a shift towards realism, which was thought to present an authentic view of the world as if one was holding a mirror up to nature. While romantic literature presented the authentic self as residing in or being understood through nature, this often provided a sentimentalized or romanticized view of the self in the landscape. For the modernist, authenticity lies within the abstract landscapes of art and literature. Authenticity is the hunger felt by poor artists, the awe felt by viewers in art exhibitions, the frustration and passion felt by aspiring writers, and the reality of the world they live in. This mirror that's held up to nature shows the natural landscape of the Romantic reflected in the urban landscape of the modernist. The elemental feelings of the Romantic become the authenticity of the modernist, the tranquility of nature becomes the rejuvenation found within art, and the natural landscape becomes the environment for growth, chaos, and self-discovery. Although taking very different forms, Romanticism and Modernism both faced the destruction of their surroundings. The Romantics turned inward to focus on one's interiority, using the inner self and past experiences as a means of escape and even comfort. This preoccupation with interiority became a major theme of Romanticism as poets strove to understand the nature of the individual or the self. But this inward turn would not be enough for the modernist. While the Romantics were able to turn to nature as a safe haven, the shifting modern landscape now required a different approach to the question of the individual. Now the question of identity arises. Who are you within the ruins? The bustle of Paris did not provide exactly the same spaces for reflection, but it did push for a new approach to interiority. Within the writing of the modernist, we have both an inward and outward perspective that appears simultaneously. We're able to see through the eyes of the writer without having access to the interiority of the mind. This inability to separate the inner from the outer world makes the inner self become alienated and strange, to the point where there is no longer an interior to escape to. We've already seen how modernists still create distance without the critical reflection within the writing, but this lack of reflection prevents the inner self from developing. The industrial environment also removes the humanness from the landscape, as the green spaces of the Romantic era are now replaced by factories, shops, and other types of infrastructure. The human form becomes lost within the growing urban center, as it no longer has a space for reflection or even an outlet for understanding. This near absence of the human form makes identity a figment of the imagination. But this doesn't mean that the human form is entirely gone. Rather, it exists in fragments. Modernist literature does not provide the entire picture as Romantic literature does, instead feeding the audience pieces of the story to put together themselves. The mention of imagination is important here as well, as the mind's ability to imagine was another important theme in Romanticism, being used to understand one's experiences as well as piece together parts of one's identity or understand how the landscape influences the individual. The only difference between the Romantic and Modernist imagination is that the Modernist does not piece together the whole, leaving one's identity in fragments. For example, Stein's descriptions of people in paintings leave much up to the imagination, as they only provide small details of the overall picture. In autobiography, Stein, or Alice, goes on to talk about a fellow acquaintance, Alice Prinsett, but the only image the reader is provided with describes her as having a certain wild quality that perhaps had to do with her brutal thumbs and was curiously in accordance with her Madonna face. She describes the painting quite generally as well, saying that a portrait of a woman with a long face and a fan was very strange in its color and in its anatomy. Both of these descriptions not only leave a great deal out, but also draw our eye to details that one does not typically look for. The brutal thumbs of Alice Prinsett or the strange anatomy of the portrait create a multitude of images in one's mind, essentially creating a shifting identity that may vary between readers. Using the imagination, the idea of the modernist identity can be understood as a mask or a persona that changes depending on the environment or the situation. While nature provided a stable basis to understand the Romantic self, the modernist self faces an endless search in a constantly changing environment, essentially seeking reality at a different level possessed by the human consciousness. Romanticism sentimentalized the imagination, but modernists sentimentalized the imperfections of the human consciousness. For Hemingway, a local cafe defines him as a local writer, a small Parisian apartment makes him a husband and a father, a local bookstore sees him as a loyal customer and trustworthy friend, and Paris defines him as a hungry artist. Stein's Paris also molds her, or Alice, into various identities. The Rue de Fleury transforms her into an important part of the local art community and a close friend. The galleries mark her as an avid art collector, and Paris defines her as an influential writer. The modernist consciousness cannot be defined as one fixed idea, instead finding stability in the promise of instability. The imperfections of the imagination and human consciousness shine in the writing of this period, as the reader is able to see through the eyes of the author, but not quite fully understanding the meaning behind said words or allusions. Standing with his wife on a bridge just outside of the Louvre, Hemingway states what they see, saying, "There it was, our river and our city." While the words on the page paint a picture of Hemingway's Paris, what is seen can be described as anyone's city, anyone's literature, and anyone's identity. Although they're known for their experimentation, the modernists have still managed to repurpose many motifs of their predecessors in the search for identity. Living in a drastically altered environment, the modernists have been able to use romantic fragmentation to not only reflect on their lives differently, but to use this distance to alienate the reader and themselves from the world that they create. Within this world, their relationship to the landscape has taken on a slightly different appearance, moving more towards an authentic view of the world that still contains some semblance of the tranquility of nature. And in the search for identity, the human consciousness becomes the new romantic imagination, highlighting the fragments that make up the imperfect whole. Writing can tell you a lot about a person, but it's not just a matter of what you see. Rather, what are you looking for?